Okay, hear me out on this one. I swear I'm not insane. I'm just a nitpicky idiot who overthinks unimportant topics way too much. But I think Final Fantasy fans do not exist. Not as in that every person who says they are a Final Fantasy fan are actually lying and it's all just one big conspiracy to launder money or something and nobody actually ever bought a Final Fantasy game and we have always been at war with Wutai, etc, etc. No, what I mean is, technically speaking, based on the arbitrary rules that I'm about to explain, it is impossible to actually be a Final Fantasy fan. You see, whenever I reference the Persona series, which I think I did once maybe in the Cyberpunk 2077 review, I think, but trust me, I totally talk about Persona all the time with my friends, which definitely do exist, and when I do, I tend to reference the new Persona games as, well, the new Persona games. The new age, the current age, Personas 3 through 5, something like that, in order to clearly distinguish them from Persona 1 and 2 because they are a totally different beast of JRPG, and if you are a fan of one side of the franchise, then you might be a fan of the other one as well, but that's not guaranteed, and they do still in some way or another actually share a bit of DNA, if only as much DNA as they share with, say, Shin Megami Tensei, but altruisms are definitely there. Which is why it's so weird to me that Final Fantasy as a series acts a lot more unified than Persona, even though arguably it is the messiest franchise to ever exist. I mean seriously, go play Final Fantasy 1. Hell, not even necessarily the very first one, but the new Pixar Remaster one, which has a different MP system that brings it closer to the modern titles instead of the original system from the NES. And after you're done, go play Final Fantasy 15. And then tell me both of these belong to the same franchise with a straight face. Go on, try it. You can't. It's a ridiculous notion. And that's why Final Fantasy as a series is so fascinating to me. It jumps through stories, characters, worlds, art styles, and gameplay systems with seemingly reckless abandon, that in the end you eventually get to a point where you wonder, wait, what even is tying this series together? You start with turn-based classical fantasy through a Japanese lens, of course, and then suddenly it's actually action turn-based now, and oh wait, now it's cyberpunk. Just kidding, it's actually fairy tale fantasy, except when it's actually based on, I think, Indonesian architecture, and it's actually purely turn-based again, but with action commands until we decide it's just real-time now. Also Car. The series straight up got 2 MMOs that are part of the mainline titles. These are not spin-off MMOs, they are straight up main numbered titles, because who gives a shit anymore? Now, this is the part of the video where you might have already figured out where I'm going, or maybe you think that I use the title as clickbait and will not truly elaborate on why I think Final Fantasy fans do not exist. Allow me to put those worries to rest by presenting my thesis. It is impossible to be a fan of Final Fantasy as a franchise because Final Fantasy has no consistent core tying game to game for you to be a fan of in the first place. Oh sure, we get chocobos and phoenix downs in each game, but that is so superficial, I think it only makes my point stronger. After all, are chocobos and item names the only thing necessary to make a game Final Fantasy? If Bahamut and Ifrit show up as summons, is that all it takes? If I take a Chocobo plushie right now, and shove it up my ass, do I become Final Fantasy? And that is my thesis. I don't think you can be a fan of Final Fantasy as a whole. Sure, you can be a fan of specific games, you can be a fan of Final Fantasy 6 and 9, or 11 and 14, or 1 through 5, and you can even be a fan of every single Final Fantasy game. However, you'll still just be a person that happened to like 16 plus games individually, basically being the fandom equivalent of a lottery winner. But that is still not a person that likes Final Fantasy as a whole, because Final Fantasy as a concept does not actually exist. You can try to reach and grab it, but there is nothing there. Okay, so you think I'm crazy. Okay, maybe I am, but that doesn't mean that I don't have a point. All I have to do to prove it is to search for the polar opposite of Final Fantasy, and luckily it is very close by. It comes in fact from the very same company. I'm talking about, of course, Dragon Quest. Dragon Quest is an impressive feat. It is a game that tries to be as purposely outdated as possible, and I mean that in the best way possible. It is a monolith, a comfort food series for JRPG fans that is always there and is one of the few cases where I can say that if you like a single game in the series, you probably like every single entry all the way to the NES. Sure, you have your favorites and you will inevitably run into a mechanic in an entry that you really hate, but there's still a good chance that you'll find something to love in every single entry, and that's a statement that you can't say about many franchises these days. Franchises change with time after all, but Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest stand on polar opposite sides of the change versus stability spectrum, and you can easily see why. Dragon Quest always has classical JRPG turn-based combat. Dragon Quest has always been using the same character designer, Akira Toriyama of Dragon Ball fame, ever since the very beginning, and unlike the work of Yoshitaka Amano, which is usually reserved only for box art these days, Akira's style is used for every single character. It is very well translated to every single character, especially including the enemies, many of which just keep recycling themselves entry after entry, until even if the story changes and the graphics evolve, almost every single other element from superficial to the very core is kept the exact same. This evokes a strong sense of identity that immediately lets everyone recognize a Dragon Quest game at first glance. The best thing for me about this entire affair though is that it is very hard at first glance to figure out just how we got here, and that's probably because of how little Final Fantasy changed between iterations. First we got active turn-based combat, then the setting completely changed but the combat was still familiar, and then there was a big difference between the settings of 7 and 8 and 9, but all of them used these sort of pre-rendered backgrounds that got us all used to the wildly different settings that built the worlds. So even when 10 came along, back to the usual turn-based affair, it still had the sort of pre-rendered backgrounds from previous entries. So basically my point is that Final Fantasy is the ship of Theseus of video game. If the art style is getting outdated, so we change it, and if we tweak the gameplay just a little bit, and then if we change the soundtrack and the consoles and the graphical power, eventually we will have changed the entire franchise and we are left to ask, is this even the same franchise? We just don't know. Of course, I have to acknowledge that I could simply be wrong. It could simply be that it is hard to grasp the core of Final Fantasy because what is in there is actually a bit more abstract. It is not a setting or a continuous plot that makes these games special, it's more like a promise. A promise that whatever game has the Final Fantasy label will do its utmost to deliver to you the most modern version of a JRPG possible, with the latest, fanciest graphics, the coolest, fanciest gameplay, and characters dressed in the most glamorous, fanciest clothes. Of course, if that's the case, that opens up a whole new can of worms about how remasters and remake would work in a franchise like that, but I ain't going to talk about that today. Because ultimately, this video is not, and I want to make this very clear, it is not about gatekeeping who is a true Final Fantasy fan or not. After all, the premise is that being a Final Fantasy fan is impossible. But I'm not going to be the ultimate gatekeeper who kills the entire concept of fandoms with facts and logic either. As fun as that would be. Instead, I just wanted to stop you for 10 minutes or so and get you to think critically about just what it is that we truly are fans of. In a world where, in a long enough timescale, every piece of what we love will eventually be replaced, so long as new entries get added into our favorite franchises. Time stops for no one, so what is it that makes them special to us? Could there possibly be an immaterial heart at the center of each one, calling out for us? In these uncertain times, only one thing is for sure. We Ace Attorney fans will never have to deal with this shit. This franchise is gonna fucking die like this, mark my words.